What's going on, everybody? It's Jay here from Nerd Takes, and today I wanted to give you my take on the first episode of the new Disney Plus series for Star Wars called The Acolyte. So, this review is going to be a little bit different than my normal ones, where those are more kind of structured and concise. This one's going to be a bit more of like an open dialogue because there's a lot that I have to say about this show in terms of the way it was made, from writing to acting to just general flaws in storytelling. So I kind of wanted to just go through scene by scene the whole episode and break it down a bit. Now, this is going to be full spoilers, which is something I don't typically do in my reviews. But because I really need to use specific examples to show where there was flaws in it, I'm going to go ahead and just do a total spoiler review. So if you haven't watched the episode yet, I definitely recommend you watch it first, then come back and watch this because you are going to find out exactly what happens. So, with that said, I guess let's just start getting into it. So, the show opens up on the planet Ueda, where we get our first look at least one of the antagonists of the show. She enters a bar where there's a Jedi Master at a table with a group of others. She very awkwardly challenges this Master Jedi, whose name is Andara, to a fight by entering a very silly looking fighting stance and saying the terrible line of, "Attack me with all your strength." It is very cringe. Andara then refuses this request and says the Jedi do not attack the unarmed, to which the masked character then replies, "Yes, you do," implying that there's some sort of history between the characters, I guess. And then she attacks the others at the table. Now, I'm not really sure why she attacks the others. They didn't seem to be bodyguards of any kind, and frankly, a Master Jedi would not need any bodyguards, so I'm not really sure what the thought was there. But I suppose maybe they just wanted a larger action sequence out of this scene, so there we go. The choreography in this scene isn't particularly good. It's a little bit of taking turns so that she can one by one kind of take care of each of these individuals she's attacking. At one point, there's a creature whose blaster conveniently gets stuck in its holster, allowing her enough time to flip a table for cover and then actually use it to then attack that individual. It just kind of played out as if it was very planned and not a realistic fight sequence. After she takes care of those individuals, she and the Jedi kind of go into battle with one another. And again, the choreography isn't the worst I've ever seen, but it's also not great either. It's a little bit slow and it plays a bit like a dance sequence more than it does any kind of realistic fight. Everybody in the bar starts to flee, which actually brings up a point that I'll make later on, but we'll get to that soon enough. The fight continues, and it's a little bit boring. Andorra then unmasks the attacker, and she realizes then that she actually knows who it is. She seems surprised and asks, "What are you doing here?" To which the attacker delivers the really cringe line of, "I'm here to kill you." And then the fight resumes. There's just no real emotion behind the delivery of this line. It's very hollow and very wooden. And to be honest, the word choice itself just isn't all that great. There's a standoff where there's some more dialogue exchanged, and then we see the character who's attacking Andorra hiding a blade behind her back. Then both of them suddenly realize somebody's actually still in the bar with them. They look over and notice that there's somebody down below them still standing behind the bar. This struck me as a little bit odd because it seemed like everybody else that was in there had already fled, so there really wouldn't be a reason for this individual to have stayed behind. It seemed like the only reason the character was still here in the bar with the two fighting was that they needed some kind of distraction to take the attention of the Jedi so that the attacking character could have some kind of leg up on them in this fight. Which that notion is then reaffirmed by the fact that the character who's attacking Andorra then throws a blade at the person who's standing behind the bar, which forces Andorra to then use the Force to stop it in order to save that person. And while this is going on, the character attacking her then throws a blade directly at her, which hits her square in the chest. This ends up being a fatal wound and leads to the death of the Andorra character. So, right here, I immediately thought that this doesn't really make sense in the established world of Disney Star Wars, because to this point, we've seen Reva survive being impaled by a lightsaber, and we've also seen Ahsoka be inexplicably immortal to this point. So, the idea that this small throwing blade was fatal to this Jedi feels like another example of inconsistency in the logic as it pertains to fatalities in this Disney Star Wars universe. The scene ends with the now unmasked character going down to where she had thrown the blade at the person standing behind the bar in order to retrieve it, where she then begins to get ready to take out that character, seeing as they were a witness to everything that just took place, when she realizes there's a child with him and decides not to. So here I think they were trying to establish the idea that this person does still have some humanity left in them, likely setting up a predictable character redemption arc later on in the series. But it's hard to look past the failed logic and consistency of this moment. The first thing that stood out was this person wore a hood and a mask to conceal their identity. So why wouldn't they put it back on after forcefully being unmasked? It didn't really make sense. And secondly, the fact that the owner of the bar here is also protecting a child makes it even more illogical that he stayed behind to watch the fight as opposed to fleeing and protecting the child from harm. Now, I'm sure some will make the argument that he's already seen her face, so putting the mask back on wouldn't change anything. To which I'd say, okay, but then being willing to end somebody to conceal your identity doesn't really match up with walking close enough to give them a far better look than they had in the first place, and then simply just walking away over some newfound humanity. So, in the next scene, we see the same actress portraying another character who's waking up on a spaceship. You immediately get the idea that there's a dual character scenario going on here. And I have to say, between the beginning of this scene and the entire scene that took place before this, the acting is just not very good here. I just don't think she's a very talented actress. Now, I haven't seen her in anything else, but as far as I can judge off this, not great. This character essentially seems to be a mechanic on this ship and goes outside of the ship to repair a shield issue. There's some attempts at humor here, but they didn't really land for me. However, that could just be my taste in humor. Now, during the repair, another part of the ship has an issue which leads to one of the more silly things they could have done in this spot. The part of the ship with the issue catches fire. And yes, I did say it catches fire. Now, keep in mind, this ship is floating through space, like actually breathing flames that are flickering. Now, I know I shouldn't have to point this out, but apparently I do. A fire needs oxygen to, be a fire. There would be no oxygen in space for this fire to be happening. And furthermore, there would be no wind for the fire to be flickering as well. It's a major oversight in basic logic and was honestly laughable. But the fire then gives this character some kind of flashback to some trauma that we don't really see, but we hear voices and screaming. And to me, it means that they overlooked the logic of this just to try to set up this little bit of background for the character, which was just poor writing. Then a couple of Jedi show up and they're looking for this character. We find out that one of the Jedi's name is Yord, and he actually knows this character, whose name is then revealed to be Osha, because she was once a Padawan herself. She apparently left the Jedi Order for some reason we don't quite yet know. Yord and the other Jedi he's with, whose name I don't even think they mention, then proceed to tell Osha all about the crime that took place on Ueda. Then they bring in a witness who's supposed to ID the suspect. And of course, it is the bar owner who was left behind in the bar that watched the entire fight happen. So the real reason he actually was written to have not fled the bar and protect the child like any other common sense person would was that they would then need him to identify Osha as the criminal in question. Again, silly writing. Osha then claims that she's innocent, and Yord still decides to take her in as a suspect. Now, the actor who plays Yord is somebody who also is not particularly good in this role. He's very wooden, he lacks any charisma, and his line delivery just comes off as basically reading lines. Then we head to Coruscant, where we meet Master Saul for the first time. He's teaching a class where another Master Jedi, Varnestra, walks in and interrupts the class to tell him about the mysterious attacker and the death of Indara and all that. She informs him that they believe it was Osha who committed the crime, and we find out a bit more about her background and the fire that killed her family. And we also find out that she was once the Padawan of Saul. So I had a couple notes here. I thought that the actor playing Saul was probably the best that I had seen so far on the show, although I did find his delivery to be a little bit dull in terms of his lines. Master Vernestra was played by somebody who I don't think is a particularly good actress. I don't know her very well. I actually don't know anything else she's in. But in this role, she was just very bland and felt like she was just reading lines. And I also thought that it was a little bit weird of the character of Vernestra to really just be concerned with the appearance of the order if this news had gotten out about what she had believed Osha might have done. She didn't seem very concerned with looking any further into the claim from this witness that Osha was the one who committed the crime. She just seemingly wanted to get Osha, punish her for the crime, and sweep it all under the rug rather quickly. In the next scene, we go back to Osha, where she's now on a prisoner ship that is very conveniently run by droids only. I'm not sure where the two Jedi that came to actually arrest her are at this point, or what ship they came on, but obviously it wasn't this one, which seemed a little bit too convenient for what comes next, which is that the prisoners in the cell next to her ask her if she wants to join their escape plan, which she then, of course, declines. They then rather quickly free themselves from their cell, which begs the question of why they hadn't already done that in the first place and why they were just waiting to see if Osha wanted to join them. But regardless, they get out rather quickly, take an escape pod, and head on their way. During this breakout attempt, the droids that are running the ship are damaged, and then the ship starts to kind of spiral out of control in terms of its flight path, and it starts knocking into asteroids, which causes damage on the ship, and at this point, it begins to start plummeting towards the planet that it's above. During all this banging around amongst the asteroids, there's a compartment across from Osha's cell, which is knocked open. And of course, her very handy droid falls out of it, but not only falls out of it, falls right into arm's reach of her cell. Again, way too much plot convenience at this point. She then frees herself from her cell and starts making her way towards the final escape pod on the ship. Just as she's reaching it, she realizes there's one prisoner left behind and she wants to help free him from his cell so that he's not stranded on the crashing ship. Very predictably, that prisoner then gets out of his cell, hops right into the last escape pod, and actually ends up leaving Osha as the one who's stranded on the ship that's crashing towards the planet. This entire scenario just plays out very awkwardly and feels very predictable with all the plot convenience that it relies on. Osha then sits in a chair that's nearby and straps herself in with a seatbelt. Back on Coruscant, word of the escape reaches the Order, and we get introduced to Saul's Padawan at this point, who once again isn't a particularly good actor. By now, I think the theme of the acting quality is pretty apparent with this show. Saul requests permission to search the wreckage of the ship for Osha. Vernestra obliges this request. Then they drop a very awkward "May the Force be with you" line here that comes off as very cheesy. And next, we jump back to Osha, who's laying on the floor of the ship, no longer in her seat with the seatbelt, after it has crash landed on this planet. Somehow, she is completely unharmed, not even a scratch or a limp. I mean, literally nothing after falling from space to the surface of a planet. She sees a vision of another person and it kind of runs off out of the ship, and she then follows it. Then we head back to Coruscant again, where we see Saul and his Padawan preparing for the mission to go search the wreckage for Osha. Saul then informs his Padawan that Yord will actually be joining them on the mission, and the Padawan seems very dismissive of this idea. She seems to not have a very good view of Yord for some reason or another, which I don't understand why at this point. And it also comes off as a little disrespectful, given that Yord is technically a superior in the Jedi Order to her Padawan ranking, but she just kind of views him as some kind of a joke for some reason. They actually even make an attempt at some humor here with Yord, but it more so comes off as making a joke of him than making a joke in general. We then jump back to Osha, who's now face to face with the person from her vision, and we find out that the vision is actually her twin sister, May. And with that goes pretty much all the mystery that they were trying to set up to this point, because we then realized that the attacker from Ueda was actually just Osha's twin sister, May. And we also find out that neither one of the twins actually knew the other was still alive to this point. The vision then ends, and we go back to Osha, who's still laying on the floor of the ship at this point. And for a second, I thought that maybe that explained the lack of injury to her from the crash, but they actually doubled down on the idea that somehow a seatbelt must have been good enough to protect her from a fall from space. Even though she was obviously thrown from the seat that she was in, given that she's waking up on the ground 10 feet from the spot where she was sitting. Again, with no sign of even a small scratch. It was just very odd. Then we go back to the Jedis, who at this point are making their way to the crash site while giving us a bit of exposition on the history of Osha and her sister. Osha seems to hear their ship incoming, so she flees the scene of the wreckage. They arrive at the ship, and Yor determines that no one could have survived that, which is actually the proper assumption, but of course, there's some heavy plot armor on Osha at this point, so naturally she survived it. Saul's Padawan shows some more dismissiveness towards Yord, which again feels like it's out of nowhere and disrespectful towards him. And Soul seemingly senses Osha's presence on the planet and starts racing after her. They corner her on the edge of a cliff where she begins to plead her innocence. Then she essentially just doesn't stop backing up, even though they aren't really pressing forward and she knows that she's on the edge of a cliff. And of course, she slips off the edge, and Saul uses the force to stop her from falling. The whole thing just felt really awkward in terms of how it played out. There was no real reason for her to basically just walk backwards off the edge of this cliff, and it felt really forced in order to try to create a little extra drama for the scene. She then tells Saul that May is alive. Now, keep in mind, on the trip over to the wreckage with the other two Jedi, Saul had just previously stated that there's no possible way that May could be alive given that he witnessed her death himself. And immediately he just says that he believes her. And just like that, something he knew to be a solid fact, he's now willing to change his mind on based off hearing somebody who is still the main suspect in the murder of Endora simply tell him so. Again, just not a lot of logic went into this. Then, in the final scene of the episode, we see May walking along the rocks of a coastal area towards a shadowy figure who we are to presume is the one who trained her and the brains of the operation she's a part of. There's this narration that's going on, and again, I have to assume that it's from this character that we haven't met yet. And they're talking about how to kill a Jedi. The dialogue goes on to say that steel or a laser is no threat to Jedi, and that the Acolyte kills without a weapon, an Acolyte kills a dream. And as the character is saying this, they take out a lightsaber. So, few thoughts here. One, the beginning of this episode, May literally kills Endara with a steel blade, so this kind of already spits in the face of this dialogue. Two, why would this individual have a lightsaber if they don't believe that it serves any purpose in attacking Jedi? Now, in my opinion, I believe it's because it was a red saber, and that's meant to remind viewers of the dark side and Sith, and obviously to strike that, oh my gosh, type of reaction, which it didn't personally do for me, but maybe it did for others. And three, it just generally feels like a foolish thing to say, given that Order 66 seemed to do quite a number on the Jedi Order, and that was with the use of a lot of blasters, so the whole laser thing kind of goes right out the window. The whole bit of dialogue was just silly and not nearly the menacing dialogue that I think they were going for. And then that wraps up episode 1. So, obviously, the writing is incredibly flawed from a storytelling standpoint, but also in terms of the characters and logic as well. The dialogue is very weak in substance, and at times it's pretty cringe. The characters aren't really likable, in my opinion, minus maybe Saul, who still has some flaws of his own. And the fight scene we got wasn't particularly well choreographed and not very entertaining. And with the pacing being a bit slow, the episode just made for a really boring and bad watch. And from what I hear, by most accounts, this and episode 2 are meant to be some of the best of the series, so not a great endorsement of what's to come next, in my opinion. Now, in the comments, feel free to share some opinions of what you might have thought of the episode. And look, if you like this show and you like this episode, then all the power to you. You shouldn't take offense to the fact that I didn't. And you certainly shouldn't let my opinion of it dictate how you feel about it. The beauty of being a fan of movies and TV shows is that this is all subjective and we can all get different things out of it. Discussions about things like this can be pretty fun when they're done respectfully, so if you enjoyed the show, feel free to share your thoughts on it and what you may disagree with me on. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll be back again with another review soon.